So today I'm going to be giving a presentation on atomism, and specifically why atomism does not give us a sufficient account of reality. And I want to start this presentation by first defining the term atomism, because this can get a little confusing. Atomism, as I'm defining it, is a philosophical theory which says that a complete account of the world can be given through descriptions of fundamental, indivisible particles. So all that really exists, according to the atomist, are these fundamental, foundational particles which could not be divided in practice or even in theory. And the reason I want to start by prefacing this is I think sometimes people can get confused when they hear people talking about atomism because they assume we're talking about scientific atomism, the scientific theory of atoms. But what is an atom philosophically is not the same thing as what is an atom scientifically. And in fact, scientific atoms, things like hydrogen atoms or oxygen atoms or carbon atoms would not actually count as atoms in the philosophical sense because these kind of atoms can be divided into further pieces like protons and electrons and neutrons, and philosophical atoms are totally indivisible. So why would someone believe in philosophical atomism? I think that we need to account for the fact, we need to really reckon with the fact that philosophical atomism is actually pretty popular today. And I think part of the reason for that is that a lot of people assume that modern science supports atomism. For example, let's say we have an object. We look around the world and we see an object that kind of looks like, excuse my bad drawing, we see an object that looks like this. This is supposed to be a tree, if you couldn't tell, or a tree, as we might see in a second, quote unquote. You'll see why. Because the atomist looks at this and says, all right, we can observe either using our eyes or more realistically using math, theoretically, that this thing is made up of foundational, fundamental particles, which as far as we can tell, can't be divided up any further. Quarks and bosons and all that. And these particles behave in certain patterns, and because of the behavior of the particles, using the patterns that we observe from these particles, we can totally explain the behavior of this object, the tree. That's what modern science does. So the atomist looks at this and applies a principle known as Occam's razor, which is a classic principle in philosophy. Occam's razor. This is the first argument for atomism, and concludes, Occam's razor is also known as the principle of parsimony. Basically, it says that whenever you have two theories, and one of them is simpler than the other, and both of them have the same level of explanatory power, they both explain the exact same, you should prefer the simpler theory over the more complex one. And using Occam's razor, the atomist looks at this object right here and says, you can explain the behavior of this object just as well by looking at the fundamental particles and saying that these fundamental particles are all that exists in this object, as by positing that these fundamental particles exist and this larger object called the tree exists. Therefore, it is more simple and therefore preferable, more intellectually satisfying to just say these fundamental particles exist. Which is why atomism is sometimes also called mereological nihilism. That's a more recent term. It denies mereology. It denies that things really have parts, because it says that ultimately these fundamental particles are not actually part of a larger whole. They're all that exists in this object. So that's the first argument for atomism, the argument from Occam's razor. The second argument, it takes a shot at the alternative theory to atomism. And the third one will do the same too. And the alternative theory to atomism I'm going to call essentialism. Because in order to say that these atoms are not all that exists in the tree, you have to say that there's an essence of tree kind of on top of the fundamental particles. So you believe in essences above fundamental particles. You're an essentialist if you deny atomism. The second argument is just from what I would call the fuzziness, for lack of a more technical term, of essentialism. So the fuzziness argument. And The point here is just that sometimes it's really, really hard to tell when one essence becomes another. So let's take an example. Hopefully this blue marker works, because that would be ideal. So this right here is a raindrop, okay? And this raindrop is existing there with raindrop essence. Then, one day, it gets colder out, and this raindrop turns into a snowflake. This is a snowflake. Looks pretty straightforward, right? You've got raindrop, and then you've got snowflake. Well, the problem is, it's not that straightforward. There's a bunch of intermediary phases between raindrop and snowflake, and it's really hard to tell exactly the point when this becomes this. Is it when it's slush, but how slushy does it have to be? You see what I mean? So the atomist doesn't see a problem here. The atomist just says, yeah, all this is the fundamental particles within this spatial locality moving around and behaving slightly differently, and that's how you get this. But the essentialist has to say that there's a hard and fast line between this thing and that thing. That's what essentialism means, that things have different essences, and that one essence can become another. Similar example, but slightly more morbid one. Let's say you got a guy. This is Frank. Everyone say hi to Frank. Frank says hi back. Frank has his Frank essence, frankincense, and Frank is going about his day, and then one day he's hit by a car, and Frank dies. Sorry, Frank. So Frank, I told you it would get morbid. Frank turns into a corpse. So now he doesn't have his Frank essence anymore. He exists as a corpse. Okay, what's the problem with that? Well, infamously, it's kind of hard to tell exactly when someone dies. Is it when his brain dies? Is it when his heart dies? Is it when he starts decomposing? What's the exact moment when someone dies? When someone goes from having the essence of being a living thing to not having that essence. And again, this isn't a problem under atomism. Atomism just says, yeah, there's just this gradual process of atoms moving around. But under essentialism, there needs to be a hard and fast line between living and dead. So where is that point where one becomes the other? So that is a second argument for atomism, the argument from fuzziness. I want to give just briefly a third argument for atomism, which is the argument from the modern scientific theory of evolution. Now, as far as we can tell, evolution is true from modern science. Assuming this is true, at least, it seems to entail, under essentialism, that at some point, say, a wolf must have given birth to a dog. You had a wolf, and this wolf produced a dog. But that doesn't seem to make sense, because it seems to contradict the common philosophical principle that nothing can give what it doesn't have. If you're a wolf, you don't have dog essence, so how can you give another animal, your offspring, dog essence? This isn't, again, a problem under atomism. Atomism just says that the fundamental particles of the wolf were arranged in such a way that it produced an offspring which seems to have a slightly different arrangement of fundamental particles, so we call it dog instead of wolf. These are just terms that we use. So, these are arguments in favor of atomism and against essentialism. But how do these arguments stand up when we place them against arguments in favor of essentialism? And here I want to suggest three arguments in favor of essentialism and against atomism that make it absolutely certain that atomism cannot be true. And because they make it absolutely certain that atomism cannot be true, they make these arguments entirely irrelevant. Because if atomism is just off the table, who cares how much fuzziness and essentialism entails? It's being paired against an argument against a position which just isn't completely incoherent. So the first argument that I want to point to against atomism is an argument that says that the very notion of a fundamental particle is just incoherent. So I'm going to call this the incoherence argument. And this might seem a little weird to people. How can you say that an atom is an incoherent concept? And again, remember, we're talking about philosophical atomism, not scientific atomism. We're not talking about like carbon and oxygen and hydrogen and all that. we're talking about the idea that there can be a particle which could not, even in theory, be divided into further parts. And what I want to suggest is matter, by the very nature of being matter, must be able to be divisible, at least in theory. Maybe not in practice. Maybe there is a particle which could not, in practice, based on any human technology, ever be divided up. Fine. But that doesn't mean we can't divide it conceptually. We can still talk, for example, about the right half of that particle and the left half, or the top part and the bottom part, or the right part of the right part and the bottom part of the bottom part, or the right part of the right, or the bottom part. We can always keep on dividing, theoretically, any fundamental, quote-unquote, particle into further and further parts. So the idea that we can have these parts which can't be divided further, that we can totally eliminate the idea that there are parts of things, just doesn't work. So there's just no reason to accept the very notion of a fundamental particle, which is at the bedrock of atomism. The second argument is, I actually think, stronger. And that is the argument that says that atomism undermines itself because it undermines the very possibility of human knowledge. And if we can't have knowledge, we can't have knowledge that atomism is true. So I'm going to call this the knowledge argument. You could also call it like the epistemological argument. But that just sounds slightly fancier. But I'm not going to, then I would have to remember how to spell epistemology. The knowledge argument I'm drawing more or less from C.S. Lewis in his book Miracles, where he offers an argument against materialism. He says that materialism undermines all of human knowledge. And atomism is a kind of materialism, I would argue. You could have atomists who say they accept atomism, but also accept some kind of immaterial property. I would say Descartes is probably an atomist like this. But insofar as Descartes departs from materialism, he's departing from atomism. And I'm just attacking the idea that atomism can give us a complete understanding of reality. And someone like Descartes, someone who says that, yeah, material stuff is made up of atoms, but non-material stuff isn't. That's not atomism giving a complete account of reality. So all that as a caveat, I want to attack materialism, atomistic materialism. And the idea here is that insofar as some kind of thought that we have is caused not by premises leading to conclusions, but by some kind of materialistic cause, we cannot trust that conclusion. So Lewis makes a distinction between what he calls cause and effect relationships and ground-consequent relationships. So a cause and effect relationship is super familiar to our experience. When I just wrote on the board, I was the cause, using this marker, of a black spot in the shape of a letter appearing on the board. That is a cause and effect relationship. I do some action which brings about some result. A ground-consequent relationship, on the other hand, is the relationship which obtains between premises and conclusions. So when I say something like, snow is white, this is snow, therefore, this thing is white, I'm utilizing grounds to arrive at a consequence. And what Lewis argues is that these two are mutually exclusive. Insofar as something can be attributed to a cause and effect relationship, it cannot be attributed to a ground-consequent relationship. And this sounds super abstract, but let me make this concrete for you, and I think you'll see that this is actually a super intuitive principle. If one of my friends walked in here and we got into an argument, and I, in the middle of the argument, said, you are just saying this right now, just think I'm wrong because you forgot to eat breakfast this morning. I would be trying to point to a materialistic cause of what my friend is thinking. And because I'm pointing to that materialistic cause, I'm assuming that that means that there's no ground-consequent relationship, which is leading to him having the thoughts that he had. So when I'm pointing to a materialistic cause to try to point away, in a sense, from a ground-consequent relationship. And what Lewis then argues is that materialism says that every single thought that we human beings have is derivable only from cause and effect relationships. We don't have any kind of thoughts which derive only from ground-consequent relationships, which means If every single thought that we have can be traced back to a cause and effect relationship, there's no place for ground consequent relationships. And we can't trust anything that we think is true because it's all just caused by materialistic causes. And that is exactly what must be the case if atomism is true. So that's the second argument I'm going to give against atomism. The third, I just want to touch on briefly because going into it whole hog would be a presentation of its own. And in fact, it was the subject of my last presentation. And that's that atomism actually still requires the existence of God to be coherent. I mentioned Cartesian atomism, and I said that even Cartesian atomism, first of all, I think it actually wouldn't, first of all, I actually think it wouldn't be coherent, but more importantly, for the purpose of this presentation, it actually wouldn't be considered atomism in its truest sense, at least not the kind of atomism I'm attacking. But that's not how you spell theism. I'm going to embarrass myself here. I'm just going to write the word God up here. It still entails the existence of God. The reason for this is that every single atom, every single fundamental particle is contingent. There's no reason that they have to exist. There could, for example, have been twice as many fundamental particles as there are. There could have been half as many. There could have been just one. Why is it that a tree is composed of this many fundamental particles and not more? Every single fundamental particle doesn't have to exist. Its existence is contingent. And as, again, I can't go into this fully, but as every argument for God will tell you, or at least the best ones, anything which is contingent must be grounded for its existence on something whose existence is necessary. And when you get down to it, something whose existence is truly necessary must have all the other divine attributes. It must be all good and all knowing and all powerful, and importantly, for the purpose of this presentation, immaterial. And if it's immaterial, it must not be made up of atoms. And of course, if it has all the divine attributes, it must be God. So God exists, and even under atomism. He needs to explain the existence of atoms. But if God exists, and God's immaterial, then there exists something which is not made up of atoms, which means that atomism cannot give you a complete account of reality. Whatever you do, if you're an atomist, you have to cede some kind of ground to a non-atomistic theory of the world. You have to either say that God exists and he's not made up of atoms, or that like a human soul or something exists to explain the reliability of knowledge. Probably you would have to posit universals too to make knowledge reliable, but that's a separate argument. And also just the notion of an atom itself, a fundamental indivisible particle, is just bonkers. It doesn't work philosophically. So all of this shows that atomism as a concept is wrought with holes. It just doesn't work conceptually. So going back to these arguments, I think all I have to say by way of reply is they don't really matter anymore, because atomism just isn't a tenable theory. If atomism isn't a tenable theory, then it doesn't make sense to compare the pluses of atomism to the pluses of essentialism and ask which is more coherent. Atomism isn't a live option. So you can't use Occam's razor to prove atomism. Fine, yeah, there's fuzziness in essences. I agree. Sometimes essentialists have a really hard time pinpointing exactly when one essence becomes another. But a fuzzy theory, a theory that you have a hard time explaining, is still better than a theory that doesn't work at all. So this isn't an issue either. And finally, again, I want to agree. Sometimes it can be really tough to figure out how evolution works under essentialism. I think there are good explanations of how that could work. And if any of you want to ask me about that in the question section, I'll be happy to go into that. But my main point, though, is we don't have to provide reasons for why essentialism can work under, or evolution can work under essentialism, because there's no other option. Atomism isn't a live option because it's incoherent, it's self-contradictory, and it leads to conclusions which are not atomistic in nature. So none of these three objections are good objections against the idea that things have real essences, and atomism is incoherent. Thank you. Thomas.
Thanks for your presentation. maybe I had like a phobia of fuzziness.
There.
But I wanted to ask, that actually disturbs me a little bit. Is there a way we can start to say, like, okay, maybe there's an infinite amount of degrees of change between the raindrop and the snowflake, and an infinite amount before it becomes just straight up ice. Like, so does that just mean there's like an infinite number of essences? Like, is there an essence to every stage between them? Like,
so that's a good question, and I agree. Yeah, the fuzziness is emotionally compelling. But Thomas, have you ever heard of the fallacy of the beard? The fallacy of the beard. So let's say I drew a face up here. This is Frank again. He's back from the dead. Now Frank one day he doesn't shave, and he's got some stubble going around, and then he goes more time without shaving. And soon enough, it's been a week, and he's got a lot of stubble around. The question is, does he have a beard? And the point is, it's sometimes really hard to pinpoint exactly when stubble becomes a beard. But that doesn't mean there's no distinction between stubble and a beard. We can look at a guy who has a beard, and we can say, yeah, that person definitely has a beard. Like, if his face looked like this, there would be no question that he has a beard. Just because it's sometimes hard to tell when one thing becomes another doesn't mean there's not a distinction between those things. So what I would just say is there is a point when a raindrop becomes a snowflake. And yeah, it's a tough epistemological problem when exactly that point is. But our inability to pinpoint exactly when the point is doesn't mean there is not that point. I hope that's satisfying in some way. Alex.
That range of being applied to or going into a snowflake, can that range be applied to water evolution, where there's environmental changes around all that animal something else as well? I guess I'm asking. Is essential to be
Onto modern evolution?
Yeah.
I would say yes. Do you want me to go into how that works?
Yeah.
And look, this is all theoretical. This is just my own personal opinion. I think that's probably what's happening is that you have you have a wolf. I'm just going to go back to the example from earlier. And the wolf does give birth to a dog. But the wolf is not the sole cause of the dogginess or the dog nature inside the dog. I would say that, like, here's our wolf, okay? We're going to give him like fierce looking teeth so he looks like a wolf. That's a terrible looking wolf. Sorry guys. I need to stop trying to draw art. And this is our cute looking dog. Okay. So he's smiling and his head's detached from we'll give him a long neck. Okay. Part of what is bringing about this essence in the dog is the wolf. But I would also argue that there's other like environmental factors that are playing into here to make the dog a dog and not a wolf. And I would say that's able to happen because this wolf's matter has been predisposed to be more able to become like a dog, if that makes sense, through genetic modification. So this wolf's father might have looked a little less like a dog, and I'm not even going to bother. That wolf's father a little less like a dog, but they were still wolves. And this one's still a wolf. But at a certain point, wham, there's a substantial change. We're not dealing with a wolf anymore, we're dealing with a dog. And when that happens, it's not just the wolf that's bringing about the dog, it's the wolf plus other environmental factors. But that's just my opinion. Hope that helps. Any other questions? Ethan.
I would say you use slight service to science by beginning your speech by saying that science holds to atomism today by believing it can be explained by the lowest possible level of material reality, which is applied. I would say that's not quite what science does. It believes we can understand things relationally, like on the level of mathematical principles at the lowest level. Not necessarily the smallest level of matter, because I do think science today believes that we cannot divide, as you said, infinitely and then get done. That does not make sense. Understanding, but science does attempt to understand it mathematically in this sense. relationally. So could you hold to a relational reductionist? Everything could be reduced down to the laws of mathematics. Do you think that holds and could be a satisfactory way of explaining?
I wouldn't say that everything can be reduced to the laws of mathematics. I do think the laws of mathematics can be applied to all of material reality, but I think you still have to posit the existence of, for lack of a better word, stuff, like matter, physical oomphness, and something for the laws of mathematics to be applied to. So I didn't mean to dismiss modern science or to mischaracterize modern science. If I said something that sounded like that, I didn't mean to. Part of my argument is that essentialism is compatible with modern science. I take the argument that atomism is implied by modern science very seriously. I just don't think it works. So hopefully that gets at the core of your question.
Recent experiments indicate that electrons may take up zero space. If that were true, would your first argument be applicable?
So I did do a lot of research into this before giving this presentation because I wanted to make sure this argument worked. Worst case scenario, I would be willing to, that's why I do think this is the weakest argument. I would be willing to throw it out. However, I don't think I need to do that because I think there's a distinction between when scientists talk about things taking up zero space theoretically and when they talk about them taking up zero space actually. And I don't exactly know how to parse this out, but if it is the case that electrons or quarks or bosons actually do take up zero space, then they need to be just theoretical entities. Because I just think it's intrinsic to the nature of matter that matter takes up space, period. I don't see how something could be said to be matter or said to be quantifiable and not take up space. So that would be my first point. But I'm inclined to say that they probably take up space. They probably just take up like a hyper microscopic quantity of space. But thank you for bringing that up. I'm glad you did.